all participants are muted. We have a lot of participants today joining this webinar, so to make our time, the usage of our time more efficient, everybody's going to be muted. However, all of your questions are welcome and highly encouraged throughout the webinar. So at any time when you have a question, please type it down in the little box that you see in your screen. There are two boxes. One says questions, the other one says chat. Either box will work. So please type in your comments and questions there. We will be addressing your questions throughout the webinar. The webinar is scheduled to last 1 hour. We will allow a few minutes at the end of the webinar for any additional questions you might have. At the end of the webinar and during the afternoon, you will receive a recording of this webinar and a copy of the presentation. This way you will be able to review later the topics that were covered, and you will be able to share it also with other relevant colleagues. So without further ado, I'll pass the floor to my colleague Alexandra, and please again feel free to send your questions at any time through the chat box or the question box. Alexandra.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Anna, and welcome everyone who is joining the webinar today. As Anna mentioned, we'll spend the next hour talking about the GRI and the UNGC and how you can align your disclosures and reporting to maximize the resources you're putting into that and make sure that you're meeting the requirements of both of the standards. So Anna, if you can go to the next slide. There's going to be a number of agenda items we're covering today. Given that a lot of you are already familiar with the Global Compact COP requirements as well as the GRI guidelines, we'll just spend a very quick time at the beginning of our webinar today going through some of the basic requirements of the UNGC COP and the new GRI G4 guidelines. We'll spend a little bit more time with regard to looking at materiality as a guiding principle for the G4 and what that means for alignment with the UNGC COP. We'll use that as a segue to really dig into how these two different reporting and disclosure standards are aligned and how you can best understand how one feeds into the other and one aligns with each other. We'll also point out a couple of unique elements under the Global Compact with regard to the advanced criteria, just to make sure that as you're going through your process of reporting and disclosure, if you're trying to meet the requirements of those standards, there's a couple things that we want to point out to keep an eye out and to flag those for review during your reporting process. Finally, just to give you a hand up, there are definitely resources out there that we would encourage you to use. We have compiled a number of these documents and websites at the end of this presentation and have provided links to them so that as you are understanding how you need to move forward with your disclosures, you can very easily reference these documents and have them help you through that process. So next slide, please. The very first thing we wanted to convey to everyone on the phone is that the Global Compact and the GRI are complementary initiatives. At their very fundamental level, they are looking to encourage companies to improve their performance on environmental, social, governance, and ethical issues, and to disclose and be transparent and accountable for their performance on these different areas. So we wanted to just convey that there is no sort of dividing line or fence between these guidelines. They are very, very much complementary, and it's very possible to fulfill the reporting requirements under each with one document, with one reporting effort. The next slide really moves into the description of just a very brief overview of the communication on progress. And Anna, I will turn it back over to you for discussion of that.
Thank you, Alexandra. So this slide is showing the 10 principles of the United Nations Global Compact. The 10 principles are the backbone of the initiative. They are all rooted in international instruments dealing with different topics that are directly related to sustainability. The 10 principles have been divided in 4 main issue areas: human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. This division into 4 issue areas is very important at the moment of reporting because the commitment that companies acquire when they join the Global Compact is to report against these 4 main issue areas. They can go into as much detail as they want, addressing each one of the principles, or they can leave it at a more general level, and we will see next how that can be done. So the COP requirements are all established in the COP policy. When you receive this document, this presentation at the end of the webinar, you will be able to click on the title of this slide and it will take you directly to the COP policy. It's a very simple 2-page policy that explains exactly what Global Compact participants are expected to disclose in their COP. Basically, there are 3 minimum requirements that they are expected to disclose. The first one is a CEO statement of continued support. The idea behind the statement is that sustainability efforts have more efficiency if they come from the top level of the organization. That's why we want to see involvement at the very top of the organization. The second requirement is a description of actions in each one of the issue areas. And this is when we come back to what I was talking about in the slide before. In the 4 issue areas, companies are expected to disclose their actions, the actions they have taken in the last cycle to promote and to advance their performance into the 4 issue areas. If you can see at the very end of the list here, human rights, labor, etc., it says report or explain. We will talk a lot more about that later in this webinar. It's basically the principle that says if you are not reporting in one of these issue areas, you should be explaining why you are not reporting. And the last minimum requirement is a measurement of outcomes. Measurements can be done quantitatively, also qualitative measurements. In some cases, companies measure not only what happened in the past, but also they do a forecast on what outcomes they are expecting to see in the next cycle, and that all that type of measurement is valid according to the policy. So if you see on the right-hand side of this slide, we have a diagram, and it shows different levels. At the very beginning of the Global Compact, when we started back in 2000, we didn't have any levels. A company either reported or did not report. As the Global Compact grew and became more sophisticated, we realized not all reports are the same. Some companies do make additional efforts and go the extra mile in their reporting, and we wanted to highlight those efforts. And we also wanted to provide an incentive for companies to try to make more progress and disclose with more quality. That's why we created these levels. At the active level, which is, you see the light blue, are those reports that meet these 3 minimum requirements. A company that submits a report without fulfilling the 3 minimum requirements will be classified as a GC Learner report, GC Learner COP. Means the report is there, it was submitted on time, but is lacking one of the minimum requirements. And at the GC Advanced level, we have those COPs that not only meet the minimum requirements, but they also meet advanced criteria. We're going to talk about the advanced criteria in a minute, right now. Alexandra, I think if you can mute your mic, please. Thank you, much better, thank you. Now, here are the advanced criteria. The advanced criteria are 21 advanced criteria for those companies that want to go beyond the minimum requirements in reporting. The criteria are in 4 basic areas. One is external verification. The next area is implementing the 10 principles into strategies and operations. That's criteria 1 through 14. Then we have some criteria on taking actions in support of broader UN goals and issues. And then we have criteria on corporate sustainability governance and leadership. Again, when you receive this document, you will be able to click on these links and it will take you directly to the detailed criteria for you to see. Here's a document that explains how is the linkage done through GRI, which is what we are going to explain throughout this webinar. Now, how do you meet the criteria, the advanced criteria? Each criteria in the Global Compact Framework comes with a set of best practices. These are best practices that we suggest, and they have been determined after not only consultations with multiple stakeholders, but also participating in a series of meetings with initiatives that are in the same area. So to meet a criterion, here's an example, criterion 8. It describes the effective monitoring and evaluation mechanisms in the labor area. The company must meet at least one of the suggested best practices. If the company meets more than one, or hopefully all of them, great. You are welcome, and that's higher transparency and disclosure. But in order to meet the criterion, only one is required. For a COP to reach the GC advanced level, all 21 criteria must be met. If the company meets 20 of the 21, unfortunately, that COP is going to be in the GC active. Now, if the company is trying to achieve the GC advanced level and they show that they meet 20 criteria, our system in the profile of that company is going to show that this company is already meeting 20 criteria, that it did not achieve the GC advanced level because it's still missing one, but it will show the progress that the company is doing. I hope that is clear, but I'll be happy to answer any questions in that regard. Now we have our first poll. And I'm going to launch the poll right now, and in the meanwhile, I'll leave a minute or two for people to answer the poll. Please go ahead and cast your votes. Ten more seconds for people to vote. We have 70% of our participants have voted so far, so we'll give 6 more seconds. Okay. Let's share the results. We have the majority, 53% of our respondents will submit a GC active level, 16% at GC advanced, 28% is unsure. Hopefully that 28 will, after this webinar, will be sure, and hopefully everyone will be able to say they will submit a GC advanced. 2% say they will submit a GC learner COP. That means they know they don't meet yet one of the requirements. That's fine. Our communication on progress has that name of progress because we want companies to show not that they are completely perfect, but over time that they have improved in their sustainability performance. Alexandra, if you don't mind, there are a couple questions related to COP. I'm going to quickly address those. There's two of them are, if we submit an A-level GRI, will it count as a UNGC report? And there's another question, can we literally just submit the GRI report and make it count as a COP? These questions I'm going to leave because it's exactly what we are going to talk about throughout the webinar, but a short answer is yes, you can submit a GRI and it will count as a UNGC. There are a couple things that you need to take into account, and we will touch on that throughout the webinar. The other question is very interesting. Can you please address the assurance of the COP? What is the scope of the assurance? This question is directly related to the GC advanced criteria. One of the requirements is to have external verification of the COP. A couple of years ago, this requirement did not exist. Companies could voluntarily have their COPs externally assessed, and they could still qualify for the advanced level. However, throughout the years, we received complaints by stakeholders saying if we have companies classified in our advanced category, one crucial element is the external verification. So we introduced it. It started earlier this year, January 1st of 2014. When we introduced it, we were very conscious about how sometimes this is a difficult process, expensive. Not all companies have the budget and the capacity to go into the traditional auditing by a large consultancy. That's why we created in our requirement a very flexible framework for the external assurance. There is a publication that we issued on this topic. It is listed at the end of this webinar. We will show it to you. Basically, what we wanted to do is give a number of options for companies to be able to fulfill this requirement. So at the very high end, if companies want to go hire one of the big 4 accounting firms, have their whole process verified and assured, then that's one component. There are other options though. Some companies are doing, for example, peer reviews. So it's a group of companies, they get together and they establish a way of reviewing each other's reports, and that counts. We have also some stakeholder processes where stakeholders are the ones who review the report. So that's how we have determined who can conduct this. On the other hand, the topics to be assured are going to be determined by the company and by their materiality analysis. And that's what we are going to touch more on this webinar. So I hope that was clear, and I'm going to pass it on to Alexandra now.
Excellent, thank you. So I think if we can move to the slides on the overview of the Global Reporting Initiative Guidelines, G4 Guidelines. Just as we've provided a summary of UNGC COP requirements, the next couple of slides will really focus on a whirlwind tour of the G4. It's certainly a large document. We don't mean to cover every detail here, and I'm sure that most of you have had some familiarity with the G4 guidelines, given that they were issued back more than a year ago in May 2013. On this particular slide, we've included links that you can click on when you get the presentation to the main documents associated with the G4 guidelines. There are 2 key documents, the reporting principles and standard disclosure, which the reporting principle and standard disclosures is the slimmed down version of telling you what it is you need to report under the G4. And then the implementation manual is the more hefty 300-plus page guideline of very technical and specific details for each of the indicators and disclosures under the G4. If you don't want to kill a lot of trees and print a lot of paper, there's also an online version of the entire G4 implementation manual, which is really helpful. You can click through, look at indicators, read descriptions, read guidance, get definitions, and use these guidelines that way. As with GRI G3, there's also sector guidance provided for certain sectors. Not for everyone, but there are documents that have been converted from the G3 sector supplements into G4-related sector guidance. Next slide, please. The next couple of slides, we thought an efficient way to highlight the main components of the G4 is to present a quick compare. What has changed from G3 to G4? And so this is I won't dwell in detail on each one of these facets, but it's a quick way to show some of the major changes that have happened with the evolution of the G4 standard. The first and kind of major visible issue is that there are no more application levels. Whereas before, a company would issue a report and say it's a level A, B, or C according to the G3, that is no longer the case. And that's really been a focus of change because of the perceived grading structure. You know, an A report was seen as better than a C report, where in fact that really had only to do with the level of disclosure and the number of indicators that a company chose to report on. Under G4, there's two levels. There's the core level and the comprehensive level. As you can imagine, the comprehensive level requires additional disclosures above and beyond what is at the core level. There are general standard disclosures under each of these levels. General standard disclosures are disclosures that every company using the G4 has to disclose, and there are more of them at the comprehensive level. There's also a variation in terms of how a company would report on indicators related to material issues. And so at the core level, you only have to report one indicator per material aspect. At the comprehensive level, you must report fully on all indicators for that material aspect. Full and partial reporting under G3 has also undergone a little bit of a shift to the degree that you have designated an aspect and related indicators as material under G4, you must report fully on them, either for one of them under core or for all of them under comprehensive. So the full and partial designation kind of fades out of view with the transition to G4. Now, the G4 does allow companies to make omissions if information is confidential or you're still gathering data. You can be transparent about that, but they do warn that you shouldn't be omissioning too many different disclosures. Speaking of external assurance, we just had a bit of a conversation about that. And under the G4, external assurance is not required, but it's highly recommended. And what companies must do within their GRI index for a G4 report is be actually very specific as to what indicators or disclosures are actually assured. So previously, even if you had only assured one indicator, for example, your greenhouse gas emissions, and under G3 you would be able to claim a plus for your entire report. Right now, under G4, if you only assured your greenhouse gas emissions, that would be noted specifically in the index that you provide. Next slide, please. One of the major changes at the comprehensive level at G4 is the addition of about 10 or 15 additional governance disclosures. So for core reporting, this is not something that you would necessarily engage in, but I think it's a direction of the transparency that the GRI is trying to promote. Some of these governance indicators include information on compensation. They also include descriptions of how your company is managing for sustainability. So do you have a reporting relationship to the board of directors? Do you have a sustainability officer within your company? Are there ways that risk is being managed? And all these various governance disclosures are, again, required only as a comprehensive level, but it's something useful to look at in terms of identifying the direction where transparency around sustainability is headed. Materiality is perhaps the biggest change under G4, and we have this whole separate section on that in today's webinar, but I did want to point it out here that whereas under G3 there's indicator 3.5, which generally alluded to the principles of materiality, completeness, stakeholder inclusiveness, and context, G4 has brought that front and center. You actually cannot produce a G4 report without undergoing a materiality assessment and identifying what matters most to your stakeholders, to the company objectives. And the whole basis of selecting which disclosures you make and which indicators you include is based on that materiality determination. There is certainly flexibility. Companies have the option of devising their own materiality process, but you do have to keep the G4 principles of materiality, stakeholder inclusiveness, completeness, and context in mind when you go through that process. Next slide, please. I won't talk too much about disclosures and management approach. Suffice it to say that they've gotten simpler, and again, it's focused more on describing how the material issues that you select for your report, why they're important, what their impacts are, how they're managed, and how you are continually improving upon that. So aligning a little bit with the Global Compact's emphasis on progress. No company is perfect. Sustainability is always going to be a journey, and we need to be able to disclose the progress that's being made with each subsequent report. The focus on supply chain is a major change within the G4, and specifically with the inclusion of indicators both under the general standard disclosures to describe your supply chain, fairly open-ended, but certainly a new emphasis, as well as very detailed indicators that fall under aspects and specific disclosures disclosures that any company might select based on their materiality analysis. This emphasis on supply chain is a direct result of the GRI wanting to broaden the focus of disclosure so that companies couldn't hide within the context of their own four walls or of their owned or operated entities, but really would take a look further upstream and see where the raw materials and products and services are being sourced from and being able to account for those impacts. Next slide, please. So that is a truly whirlwind tour through the G4. I'm assuming that there is some knowledge of the G4 in the room today, and certainly if there are specific questions, happy to answer them now or offline. But our next poll question is similar to the first one, and this is to the degree that you are a GRI reporter, have you already issued a G4 report? Are you currently developing a G4 report? Is it something that you're planning to do in your next reporting cycle? You're not sure, or you're not using the GRI standard at the moment. So if you can just take a moment here and check off your response, we'll give everyone a minute or two to respond to this poll.
Alexandra, while people are finishing responding, there is one question on assurance, and it's given that GRI's G4 approach of assuring is on individual indicators as opposed to assuring the full report, the question is, what's the take of the UNGC framework on this topic? And the answer is, GRI's approach counts for us. As we are going to try to show in this webinar, we are completely aligned with GRI, and we try to make it easier for companies. We don't want to make companies have to do one work for GRI and another different work for Global Compact. So what you do for GRI counts for us. What we always tell our companies is just bear in mind that this is going to be vetted by your stakeholders, is going to be publicly available, and in our view, the more comprehensive the assessment, the better. So, or an explanation as to why you are limiting the assessment to some specific indicators would be in place. So that's the answer. And I think 70-something% voted, so let's close the 10 more seconds and we'll close. People are still voting.
Excellent. So thank you for posting the poll results. It seems that uptake of the G4 is underway. There's 4% of our participants on the line today have already issued a G4 report, so we applaud them for their leadership. That is certainly a big move forward and step forward in terms of kind of moving quickly on adopting the new standards. We see that 20% are currently developing a G4 report, or 35% thinking about it for their next reporting cycle. So I think that what we're seeing here is a general move and transition, companies getting familiar with the guidelines. They are a departure from the G3 in some ways, so especially with regard to the focus on materiality and value chain. And then in terms of the companies that are, or the participants on the phone who aren't using the GRI, again, hopefully that's something that you'll have the opportunity to investigate, especially if you are already reporting to the UNGC through COP. Given the alignment, there is certainly the possibility of applying both. So let's move on to the next section. And here's where we're going to dive a little bit deeper into two specific elements of materiality and value chain implementation. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see that materiality is the heart of G4. It's really the central organizing concept. And the purpose of having materiality being identifying those issues of highest importance and priority to the company and to its stakeholders, and through the impacts associated with those issues, and then really narrowing down your focus to disclose only on those issues or preferentially on those issues. We're getting away from the kitchen sink or checklist approach where you're just reporting as many indicators as possible with no prioritization as to what is truly the heart of impacts for your company. with the G4 focus on materiality, there's an element of flexibility that really wasn't there with G3. Companies are given the leeway to establish their materiality process, to select the aspects and indicators that make most sense to them based on that impact and stakeholder assessment, and hopefully to devote more depth and breadth to those particular issues that are material to them. Go to the next slide. Materiality and the COP are also aligned. If you recall back to Anna's introduction to the COP at the beginning of this presentation, and that little asterisk there of report or explain, the COP really needs to be structured, again, if relevant, covering the 4 areas of human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. But if any one of those issue areas is not deemed material by the company through a rigorous and comprehensive materiality analysis, that is grounds for simply explaining the reasons why. And the materiality analysis process, if the company can provide that description of the robust nature of evaluation, that is entirely sufficient in terms of saying, you know, we're not going to report on one of these issue areas, we're going to exclude certain GRI aspects and indicators, because in the scheme of what's most important for our company, those really don't make it to the top. And so I think that that's a point of clarification that we really want to make sure that everyone understood. And I'll just pause here and see if there's any questions on that, because that could be a point of contention, that you don't have to report everything. If it's material, report it. If it's not material, explain why.
No questions on that yet, Alexandra. I will let you know if questions come up.
Okay, so on rolling then. So the next slide gets into, that's materiality. The other thing that we also wanted to point out within the context of G4 reporting, as well as the UNGC advanced criteria, is this concept of looking beyond your own 4 walls and looking both upstream at what's happening in your supply chain, where your raw materials and your products and services are coming from, all the way through to the use of your products and services, the end of life, the disposition of whatever it is that you make or produce. What we have on the slide here is just a very generic example of a restaurant chain and their value chain, all the way from looking at the product research and development to the procurement of real estate for their locations, all the way through to food preparation and how their customers experience the restaurant experience, the dining experience, and feedback that they might provide. So within this context of the example of a value chain here, what the GRI asks companies to do, and this is a required general standard disclosure, so there's no option for responding to it, you have to respond, is where across your value chain do impacts occur? Are your impacts that are related to your material issues internal to your organization? Do they affect only your operations? Or are they external? Are they in your supply chain? Are they happening at the customer end? And being very transparent about understanding the provenance of your products and services, as well as the impacts that occur during their use and disposition. If we go to the next slide, we see that the G4 and the UNGC are actually quite aligned with this desire to be looking at the totality or a holistic nature of your company's operations and impacts both upstream and downstream. If you are reporting at the advanced level and looking at the advanced criteria under the COP, you'll see that criteria number 2 relates to value chain implementation. And if you've already gone through the GRI process of identifying where impacts happen internally or externally, you can check off this best practice of analyzing each segment of the value chain to identify risks and opportunities. So I think that's something that really points to the alignment between the UNGC and the GRI in terms of both the concept of materiality and how that plays out in report or explain, as well as this more holistic view of a company's operation and its impacts across the value chain. Okay, so let's move on to the next section. Oh, actually, I forgot that we had this example here. One of the G4 reports that Framework has worked on is the 2013 Hershey Corporate Social Responsibility Report. And this is one demonstration of how Hershey has gone and mapped out its value chain. So you can see the value chain stages across the upper right-hand portion of this chart, as well as looking at the columns. You have the priority issues identified through a materiality analysis. You have the mapping to the G4 material aspects. And you have both the little green and blue dots showing where impacts associated with material aspects happen both internally and externally. To the degree that Hershey were a signatory to the Global Compact, we can very easily point to this value chain impact diagram as a response to that criteria number 2. And across the bottom of these slides, just a note here, you don't have to go back, but every single slide that relates to an external document, there's links there, so you should be able to navigate very easily within the examples as well as some of the resource documents that we have embedded within the presentation. So those are already examples of alignment between the COP and the G4 requirements. Moving into the next slide, we have looked at areas where there are both sort of philosophical alignment as well as very practical alignment between the indicators required. Just to get back to our original premise, the COP and the G4, they're really trying to do the same thing, get companies to improve their performance on environmental social governance issues and increase their transparency, as well as show progress along the way. For the next slide, we've gone to the document that's called Making the Connection. This is a document that Anna referred to earlier, and it's actually a very useful resource. If you are a GRI reporter looking to fulfill COP requirements or vice versa, this document really lays out very clearly where the alignments are between the G4 disclosures, both the general standard disclosures as well as the specific standard disclosures, and the Global Compact advanced criteria. So for example, on this first page here, we see a listing of the general standard disclosures. G4.1, as many of you know, is the CEO letter, and that aligns perfectly with having a CEO commitment and leadership be evident within the Global Compact communication on progress. We have certain G4 34 to 55, those are the governance indicators. That aligns with mainstreaming the corporate functions and board adoption and oversight. So as you can see, this document really lays out a one-to-one correlation of G4 indicators as well as the advanced criteria for the Global Compact. For those reporters on the phone who are not at the advanced level, I think this is still a very useful document to look at, because as you're enhancing and maturing in your disclosures, this will give you a roadmap for how you can plan out future disclosures and how you can make sure that you're kind of checking off which indicators align with which standard. So you can go to the next slide. So the first slide was about the general standard disclosures. This slide starts to look at the specific standard disclosures, and here you would be reporting, if you're a G4 reporter, you would be identifying which specific standard disclosures relate to your material issues. So you would select economic, environmental, labor practice aspects and indicators if those were issues that came up as material in your analysis. And then you could also align with the GC advanced criteria, UNGC goals, environment, labor, and then the next slide shows human rights and anti-corruption. So again, this is a pretty comprehensive map of how the different advanced criteria and the Global Compact principles align with the specific standard disclosures as well as the G4 general standard disclosures. We can go to the next page. So as every GRI reporter knows, a GRI report is not complete unless it has a content index, and this is really meant to help readers of your report understand where within the report you are meeting the disclosure requirements of certain indicators and disclosures and management approach. If you are also reporting and using the one report as both a G4 report or a GRI report and a Global Compact communication on progress, one of the best practices is to include a cross-reference within your index. So you can see here we have an example from the GAP where they have their GRI indicator names and numbers. They have the level of coverage, but they also have the associated UNGC principle. And it's possible to do an index like this either at the principle level or at the advanced criteria level, keeping in mind that if you are using your Global Reporting Initiative report as your COP, you still have to upload and register that report with the Global Compact on its website. You would also still have to go through the Global Compact self-assessment if you're an advanced level reporter. So I think the indexing is really for the benefit of readers of your report. You'd still want to take that step of registering your Global Compact COP through the official means. Now, it's possible to do a combined content index. On the next slide, we also have an example of an index that is split up. So this is ERM's 2013 Sustainability Report, and they've chosen to keep them separate. So there's no hard and fast rule as to how you're supposed to provide readers with an index. It sometimes comes to plain design and how versatile your designers are in terms of combining a lot of this information. But there are many examples out there of companies that are helping readers understand how the company has met GRI requirements as well as the Global Compact COP requirements. So the final section of our webinar today is looking at some of the unique elements of the COP. And I'm using unique a little bit loosely because in essence there is pretty good alignment across the entire standards. But we wanted to point out a few areas that if you are creating a report to just keep in the back of your mind as places you might check to make sure that you're actually fully meeting the disclosure requirements of both the GRI and the COP. So this next slide will show that, I think this gets back to one of the questions asked at the very beginning of our webinar. There's no automatic, you don't get an automatic GRI and COP at the same time. You have to make sure and go through the different requirements and just cognizantly check off all the different elements of reporting that come into play for the GRI and the COP. And the COP, obviously, there are different requirements for the active versus the advanced level, but it is up to the company itself to make sure and do that check internally in order to be able to credibly say, yes, we have a report that meets both the GRI requirements and the COP requirements. So there's no like, hey, we've done a report, it's automatically a GRI and a COP. You have to go through and make sure that that's really the case. That said, both the G4 in accordance options, core and comprehensive, can qualify as a COP, and an advanced COP can qualify as a GRI report. So there's no reason that it can't. We just have to be careful to make sure that you have met all the requirements. On the next slide, we'll go into, I think the next three slides really talk about some of the elements at the advanced level. So if you're not at the advanced level, this is sort of information for you to keep in mind as you move towards that. One of the COP elements that I'm really a big fan of is this mainstreaming into core business practice. This relates somewhat to G4 General Standard Disclosure number 2, which is not required for core reporting, but is required for comprehensive, where you're talking about strategy and integration. The COP at the advanced level really wants to hear how companies are integrating sustainability considerations at the very highest levels of the organization and how that is then trickling down through the different performance objectives and criteria and the evaluation of individual employees and managers. So we're really talking about a very comprehensive integration of the organization's highest goals and principles for sustainability, and what are the mechanisms in place to make sure that everyone in the organization is aware and everyone is acting in accordance with those strategic sustainability goals and objectives. So I'm a big fan of this mainstreaming in the core business practice. I think everyone should be doing it. Clearly, criterion number 1, ask companies to start addressing that question and talking about how they are embedding sustainability and adherence to the 4 Global Compact principles across their organization. The GRI alludes to this. It does get to that question of strategy, but if you're responding at the core level of the G4, you might need some additional information to fully address this advanced COP requirement. We go to the next slide. So here again, I think we've talked about this already during our webinar in terms of the requirement under the advanced level for the COP to have some sort of external review. And as Anna was explaining, this is not necessarily a full-blown external audit by a Big 4 accounting firm. There are other ways that companies who are reporting at the advanced criteria level can respond. Reviewing by stakeholders, review by a panel of peers, and then different levels of assurance. So there's different ways that companies who are looking to meet this criteria can respond without going through an entire, very expensive, very onerous external assurance process. The way that this would play out in terms of indicating that in your GRI index is that to the degree that that external review took into account specific indicators or disclosures, you would mark those individually within the index. So again, the level of specificity is required by the GRI, but the GRI as a general principle does not require companies to seek external review. It's just something that they highly recommend. Next slide, please. Another COP element that I think most reporters would cover, regardless of whether they're trying to meet the advanced criteria, is commitment to UN goals and issues. So if you have a GRI report, the GRI does not necessarily say you have to talk about how you're supporting the United Nations goals and issues, but if you have been trying to reach the advanced level of the COP, one of the criteria specifically says, let's hear about what you've been doing. Have you been participating in network activities? Do you have different operating procedures in terms of supporting goals and issues? Have you designed different business models? So this one's a little bit of an outgrowth, but it certainly is well understood in terms of why it would be required for a communication on progress. And then we have the COP element of business and peace, and this would be specifically related to companies that are operating in areas of high risk or conflict. And so again, it's likely that a company who is producing a report that was meant to address G4 requirements as well as UNGC requirements would be meeting some of the best practices under this criteria, but I wanted to call it out because not necessarily every company would be operating in high risk or conflict environments. So that's a particular criteria that would be applicable to a subset of reporters. Okay. So we've covered a lot today, and I know that it can be a little bit overwhelming, but there is help out there. There are many resources, and we've only listed a few. The next slide has links and photographs of documents that we think are particularly useful, among them the actual G4 reporting guidelines, as well as implementation manual, the Global Compact COP policy, and the self-assessment, which is for the advanced criteria. Finally, the lower left-hand corner, that's the document that probably everyone should download and read right away, but it's making the connection, having those charts and tables of aligning GRI indicators with UNGC criteria. That's extraordinarily helpful if you're trying to assess whether or not you're meeting the requirements of both standards. And then finally, there's your path to external assessment document there, which really gets into that question of what other than full external assurance can you do in order to meet that external review criteria under the UNGC COP advanced level. So these are just a couple of resources, and we also have later on the presentation our phone numbers and our pictures, so that if you do have questions that are more specific or that you think of when you're lying in bed at night thinking about the United Nations Global Compact and the GRI, feel free to give us a call, send us an email, and we'd be more than happy to take some more time to go through this material in detail. If we go back one slide, I did want to point out that for members of the U.S. network, there is another webinar coming up on September 24th, and this will really be focusing on responsible supply chain management. So another very important area, one that certainly the GRI is interested in having companies cover, and an opportunity to learn a little bit more about best practices, trends, and examples of companies who are doing very interesting things. And that will be presented by SEDEX on behalf of the U.S. network. So I'll take a big breath there and see whether there's any questions, Anna, that you've received.
Yes, we have a couple. I also want to go back here and give a piece of information because I presume people who have been listening now are very eager to report at the GC advanced level. So this is the type of questions they will see in their self-assessment. You guys, when you go and start submitting your COP, you will start seeing in your screen questions such as this one. Criterion 15, for example. Did you meet it by explaining in your report one of these best practices? In each one of the criterion, you will see as the first best practice this one. It says, does your COP include any relevant policies, procedures, and activities that your company plans to undertake to fulfill this criterion? Now, for a couple years now, we have been receiving critiques from stakeholders saying that we are creating a situation here by having this best practice where companies could mark plans. They say, yes, I'm planning to do this, and they move on, yes, I'm planning, and so on and so forth. They click 27 times on plans to fulfill the criterion. That report achieves the GC advanced level, but in reality, it's not an advanced report. It's just something, it's a company that discloses plans. That's the concern by stakeholders. We did not take action immediately on this concern because we have been carefully monitoring the data coming in, and we do not have one case in the years we have having our level, advanced level of companies that only mark plans. However, when you go, as of 2 weeks from now, if you submit a GC advanced report, you will see this best practice listed at the end of the list. We wanted to tone down, not put it as first, put it in the last place, and then it says here, plans to undertake to fulfill this criterion by its next COP. So we limited very concretely the time frame for these plans. So that's one little thing you will see is not implemented today. It will be implemented at the end of this month. You will see that change. And the other questions we have is, one is, how do we get to know and network with other participants? This is a very interesting question because traditionally when we do webinars, our participants want to be, are concerned about their privacy. They say our company is just studying about this. We don't want to be put out in the public and my company being exposed as someone who's, so we are careful in keeping participants' privacy. However, given this question and the interest here, what I can do is I'm going to send a question to all participants here. We have close to 70 people listening to this webinar today. I'll send a question saying, yes, please share my information, or no, don't share my information. And whoever agrees to share the information, I will go on and send name, email address, and company. In the email address, usually the company is listed. And we have another question, Alexandra. I'll let this one for you, which says, what are the links of these two frameworks, GRI and Global Compact, with integrated reporting? It's a very interesting question. Integrated reporting is right at the forefront of the discussion now, and we actually work together with them. Global Compact has a seat in the working group and in all of the instances of work of IIRC, so the work is aligned. I don't know if, Alexandra, you want to provide details on that.
Sure, and I don't presume to speak for the GRI myself, but I do know that there's a memorandum of understanding between the GRI and the IIRC as well, and that both organizations are striving to work together so that there is support for integrated reporting. I think the concept of having that strategic and financial connection with the GRI is a very strong interest of theirs, and the movement towards aligning the GRI-based reporting with integrated reporting is definitely something that's being worked on and strong. So I don't think that there's any definitive guidance out there right now, but there certainly is understanding between the two organizations that the G4 and the IRC guidelines are compatible and they are not mutually exclusive, just as the UNGC COP and the G4 are not, not aligned. So I would, say stay tuned, and the whole concept of G4 being based on materiality is definitely a step in the direction of integration.
Exactly, and from the UNGC's perspective also, if you see in our self-assessment, we always ask companies, what is the format of your report? Do you do a standalone COP? So is it a one report only with COP information? Or do you include COP information in your sustainability report? Or do you integrate information, financial and non-financial information, in one end report? And we say we encourage the last one. So we are very supportive of integrated reporting. We encourage our companies to integrate the information because we believe that provides a more comprehensive view of the performance and the situation. As Alexandra said, we don't have aligning documents with IRC yet. We are in conversations about that, but we believe the process of IRC is still in its very early stages, and the linkage document will come a little later when things are more established. I don't see any more questions right now. I'm going back to the slide with our contact information, and people have a few seconds to drop in their last questions.
And I would just mention again that if there are any specific questions that do come up, feel free to contact any one of us. Just want to thank Katie for her contributions to this, to the development of this webinar as well. And feel free, because there is a lot of information and it's complicated, and we're happy to help.
No more questions, Alexandra. So.
Excellent. Well, thank you everyone for listening in. The last slide does have some information on framework, but we very much appreciate your participation in the call today. And Anna, thank you so much for having us.
Great. Thank you guys very much. Thank you to the U.S. local network, and we hope to hear from everybody with their GRI report and their GC Advanced report, hopefully. Thank you very much.